Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Rescuing Lake Erie, an Assessment of Progress. This is Jennifer Caddick, Vice President of Communications and Engagement here at the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and I will be moderating today's webinar. I am joined on today's webinar by our presenters. They are Molly Flanagan, Alliance for the Great Lakes Vice President of Policy, who is here with me in Chicago. Tony Moss, who is Freshwater Futures Manager of Strategy, and he is joining us from Ontario. Charlotte Jameson, Michigan League of Conservation Voters Government Affairs Director, is joining us from Michigan. And Christy Meyer, Ohio Environmental Council's Vice President of Policy, is joining us from Ohio. Thank you very much to our speakers for participating today. We are excited to have several hundred people registered for today's webinar. Because we have so many attendees, all participant lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar. We will do our best to make it through the presentation to leave plenty of questions, plenty of time for questions at the end. You may submit a question at any time during the webinar by using the chat box as illustrated here. We will do our best to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. And so now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Tony Moss with Freshwater Future. Tony?
Thanks, Jen, and welcome everyone. Great to see the level of interest in the webinar today. So I'm just going to kick off with a bit of context around the problem with the first slide here. And as the quotes that you see before you on the slide that we collected from various media sources over the summer indicate, the news of these large and harmful algal blooms that are plaguing the waters of Western Lake Erie is really not new news. So we're not necessarily describing a new problem to you here today. This year, another massive algal bloom caused major concern across Western Lake Erie, impacting recreational water use and of course worrying millions of people whose drinking water comes from the lake. As you probably know, in some places this summer, as it is the case in most summers, these harmful algal blooms can contaminate water in their vicinity with microcystin, which is a liver toxin. So what's behind the problem? What's causing this persistent problem of harmful algal blooms in Western Lake Erie? Well, it's a combination of factors and forces, including climate change and impacts of invasive species. But the primary cause of Lake Erie's harmful algal blooms is too much phosphorus reaching the lake. And while the phosphorus can come from a number of sources, the largest source of runoff pollution occurs when rainfall and snowmelt wash fertilizer and manure that's been spread on agricultural fields into the streams that then flow into the lake. So this phosphorus from runoff pollution is what is fueling this bumper crop of algae that we are seeing now almost every year in late summer and early fall in Western Lake Erie. The important thing to recognize in this is that this is a problem that is preventable and solvable. The research shows that, as I indicated, the majority of phosphorus that comes into Western Lake Erie is from agricultural lands. So reducing this pollution will significantly reduce the size and severity of harmful algal blooms, and of course, in turn, improve the overall health of the lake and the people and risks to people that depend on it for various reasons. So what we're trying to do with the report that we're presenting to you today, Rescuing Lake Erie, is to push for action on the policies that are needed to solve this problem. Lake Erie and every Great Lake really ought to be safe and clean for all people and not so fouled with algae that it's a threat to human health, to wildlife, and to the regional economy. So I'm going to pass things over to Molly, and she's going to discuss the commitment made by the governors of Ohio and Michigan and the Premier of Ontario in 2015 to do something about the problems that are facing Lake Erie.
Thanks, Tony. Hi, this is Molly at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. And in June of 2015, many of you joined with us and other people across the Great Lakes region in successfully pressuring the governors of Ohio and Michigan and the Premier of Ontario to commit to reducing the amount of phosphorus pollution running into Western Lake Erie by 40% by 2025. That's a pretty audacious goal, and it's needed because we need to take big action to solve the problems in Lake Erie. We applauded the governors and premier for making a real commitment to fix the problem. But this year, another large toxic bloom is dominating headlines around Lake Erie, and many of you are wondering what's being done to clean up Lake Erie. Many people who depend on Lake Erie want to know what actions the jurisdictions are taking to reduce harmful algal blooms. And they want to know how far those actions are actually going to take the jurisdictions toward achieving the 40% phosphorus reduction goal that they committed to in 2015. Next week, starting on October 20th, the Great Lakes governors and premiers are meeting at their leadership summit in Detroit. At this meeting, they should update you, the public, on their progress toward achieving that 40% phosphorus reduction goal. It's been more than 2 years since they made the commitment, and with another big bloom this year, it doesn't look like a lot of progress is being made. People around the region deserve an update, and we're going to be at that summit so we can provide it to you.
And now Tony's going to give an overview of the report we're releasing today, Rescuing Lake Erie. Tony?
Absolutely, yes. Thanks, Molly. So I'm going to do, as indicated, a quick top-line view of overview of the report. And we've hit it a couple of times. I indicated in my opening remarks that what we're trying to do here is to push for action on the policies that are needed to drive change and drive the change that's needed to realize a healthy and clean Lake Erie. And in order to do that, we need to first have a reasonable or a good understanding of what policies are in place and how they're functioning. So that's what the purpose of this report is. Together, the Alliance for the Great Lakes and Freshwater Future teamed up to assess efforts by Ohio, Michigan, and Ontario towards meeting that 40% reduction commitment. So what this report does, and just to reinforce, we looked at the level of policies. It establishes a baseline evaluation of state and provincial policies for reducing phosphorus pollution. So we're trying to pull together a regional view of the policy frameworks that are in place. Recognize a lot of the implementation of these policies happens at the state level, but it's important to have a regional view given this is a shared problem. Methodology, or how we did this. Well, to create the report, we reviewed current legislation, things on the books, regulations, and policy in each jurisdiction, and also consulted with experts to compile the information that we needed to undertake what is really a comparative analysis of the current status of efforts by the 3 jurisdictions to address runoff pollution. So it's a fairly comprehensive regional view of the policy situation. And while we won't claim that it covers everything, it does attempt to define and assess the most significant policies needed to achieve the nutrient reduction to result in a healthy Lake Erie. As you see on the slide here, the report is structured around 3 broad policy areas. 1, reducing phosphorus pollution from agricultural sources. 2, reducing phosphorus pollution from urban sources. And 3, a look at the monitoring and reporting of phosphorus loadings and reductions, which is critical to understanding the situation in terms of the first 2 key elements. Are we making progress, or what's the current status? We examined both the existence and the nature of the policies for reducing nutrient pollution, as well as the existence and nature of the accountability and enforcement mechanisms that support their implementation. So what does that mean? Well, we looked at, first of all, whether there's a policy in existence on the books at all as it relates to a number of factors underneath these 3 broad policy areas, and then dug a little deeper to understand the particulars of the policies in each jurisdiction. And in terms of assigning our assessments, we used a 3-tiered approach, and you'll see that in the coming slides. So policies will be designated as either non-existent, and those are assigned when no policy directive is in place, or they are so narrow in scope and application that they're basically non-existent. Incomplete is assigned when substantive policy directives are in place, but there are loopholes or limited oversight or enforcement. And third and finally, there's the category of complete. And those are assigned when substantial policy directives exist with no loopholes and/or there is significant oversight and enforcement in place. So just keep that in mind, because we're going to dig into some of the details of the policy regimes in the 3 jurisdictions in the coming slides. Before we do that, I'm going to pass it back over to Molly for an overview of the report findings.
Thanks, Tony. Unfortunately, progress by the jurisdictions to address harmful algal blooms has been slow, too slow. In our report, we found that all of the jurisdictions are lacking the comprehensive approach that is really needed to effectively address harmful algal blooms. When you see the slides that summarize policies by jurisdiction, you'll note that none of the jurisdictions has any policies in place that fully address the critical issues we've identified around reducing pollution from agricultural runoff, urban sources, and monitoring and reporting. Remember, Ohio, Michigan, and Ontario have committed to creating clear pollution reduction plans to meet the 40% phosphorus reduction commitment. However, the draft plans that they've produced to date are vague, and they lack clear timelines for implementation. And in many cases, they're not enforceable. Additionally, the jurisdictions haven't provided the necessary funding and personnel to implement the plan. Our report details the lackluster effort to date by Ohio, Michigan, and Ontario to clean up Lake Erie. It raises serious questions about the pace and level of commitment by the jurisdictions to meet their goal of reducing runoff pollution by 40% by 2025. The goal will never be met if Ohio, Michigan, and Ontario don't act quickly to implement the policies and regulations needed to curtail agricultural and urban sources of pollution. And now I'm going to turn it over to representatives on the ground in each jurisdiction to talk about their work and what they are seeing from each state and province when it comes to rescuing Lake Erie. Christy, tell us what's happening in Ohio and what you think needs to happen next.
Thanks, Molly, and good afternoon. Tourism in Ohio is a $40 billion industry, and more than a third of that comes from just 8 counties along the lake. And the lake supports more than 119,000 jobs. In addition, more than 3 million Ohioans source their drinking water from Lake Erie. And unfortunately, each year, people in the Toledo area brace for another toxic algal bloom. No longer do they ask, will there be a bloom? It's how big and how toxic will the bloom be, and how prepared do I need to be? And as we heard, we know the sources of this toxic algae causing pollution includes runoff from industrialized agriculture, which is the largest source, and raw and partially treated human sewage. We also know from the science, Ohio, particularly the Maumee River watershed, is the largest contributor of phosphorus pollution to the western Lake Erie Basin, and therefore Ohio has an outsized role to play in solving this problem. In addition, Ohio bears a lot of the problem or the result of that pollution, and particularly the city of Toledo, as we saw that huge bloom back up into the Maumee River just a couple weeks ago, and it lasted for a long time, and as we saw many years prior. Now, Ohio has taken some critical initial steps to address agricultural and urban sources of phosphorus that are flowing into Lake Erie. And recently, the Ohio Lake Erie Commission released Ohio's draft domestic action plan, or the plan to put Lake Erie on a nutrient diet by 40% by 2025. And there are some really great provisions in this plan, like the restoration of coastal wetlands in Sandusky Bay, requiring all wastewater treatment plants to really ratchet back their phosphorus in their discharge waters, and a farm stewardship certification. That's great. But the plan and the laws that Ohio has put into place already are simply not enough to achieve the 40% reduction in the phosphorus flowing into Lake Erie. And I think we know this from the science, but we've also saw this when the US EPA released their draft domestic action plan, or their plan to put Lake Erie on a nutrient diet. And we also know that more of the same is not the answer. So Ohio needs to really stand up and be a leader here, and must take additional steps to ensure that it is the leader in achieving the 40% phosphorus reduction goal. And to do that, They need to completely, the state of Ohio needs to completely ban the spreading of manure and chemical fertilizer on frozen and snow-covered ground, saturated soils, and if there will be a 50% chance of precipitation or more that day. Right now, we just have a restriction saying don't spread manure or chemical fertilizer on these particular days. The state needs to require farmers to work with certified professionals and to develop and implement a comprehensive nutrient management plan outlining which best management practices are needed on particular fields, and requiring that farmers to only use the amount of manure or chemical fertilizer needed in the soil for optimum crop growth. Currently, there are farmers with nutrient management plans, and there are farmers that are doing great things. They're undertaking best management practices like cover crops and tile drainage management, but not on the scale required to curb the tide of toxic algae in Lake Erie. And the state needs to encourage the utilization of green infrastructure, including rain gardens and bioswales, to help alleviate that stormwater runoff and lessen the burden on our wastewater treatment plants. Ohio's wastewater infrastructure, like all other states, is antiquated and in desperate need of repair. And according to the American Society of Civil Engineers, Ohio's wastewater infrastructure needs total more than $14 billion. Communities, though, like Junction Coalition in Toledo, are really taking on this. We have a part in this too, and they've applied for funding under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and Urban Waters Grant to reduce their storm runoff and by building bioswales in their community, and they've seen a lot of benefits from that. The state also really needs to improve water quality monitoring in order to determine if Ohio is making progress in reducing phosphorus flowing into Lake Erie, and we also need to require the state to report the progress that it's making towards meeting that 40% reduction phosphorus goal. Ohio has made some great progress in this area. I know every year for the past couple of years they continue to put in more monitoring stations, but in some cases it's just grab samples rather than continuous monitoring, so we really understand what's going on. And in other cases, we have no data, water quality data current water quality data on some of the smaller watersheds. So we really need a baseline so we know how we're progressing. And then there's a real need for funding for all of this, because this is going to take a lot of money to get all of this done. But unfortunately, this problem, you know, it just will not be solved overnight. But the longer we wait to start to put into place these measures, the more costly the solutions will become, and the more the communities, businesses, and wildlife suffer. Ohioans, especially those in the Toledo area, cannot wait any longer, nor should they have to wait any longer for the state to take these measures, put them into place, and to put Lake Erie on a nutrient diet. So I'm going to turn it over to Charlotte from Michigan. Thanks. Thanks, Molly.
Thanks, Chrissy. As the Great Lakes state, freshwater is a key driver of Michigan's economy. The Pure Michigan Tourism Advertising Campaign has generated $8 billion for Michigan's businesses over the past 10 years. And Michigan has the highest number of jobs, close to 526,000 in the region that depend on the lakes, according to a study by Michigan Sea Grant and the University of Michigan. These jobs span industries that include manufacturing, recreation and tourism, agriculture, science, research, and shipping. Lake Erie is the most glaring example of a chronic algae problem that is degrading water quality and aquatic ecosystems in lakes and rivers across Michigan. Runoff pollution from industrial agriculture and concentrated animal feeding operations, failing septic systems, and wastewater treatment plants are fueling harmful algal blooms across the state, from our Great Lakes to our inland lakes. And Michigan does not have the policies in place to stop these harmful algal blooms. Michigan must take critical first steps to ensure that it pulls its weight in achieving the 40% phosphorus reduction goal, addressing harmful algal blooms across the state. Currently, Michigan's plan to address Lake Erie includes some good provisions, but it doesn't quantify how all of the programs and activities outlined within the plan are going to add up to the 40% reduction. And our view is that if you take them all together, it likely won't. We would like to see the state move forward with banning manure, biosolid, and fertilizer application on frozen, snow-covered, and saturated ground. We'd also like to see some requirements for comprehensive nutrient management plans that ensure that farmers conduct annual soil testing and limit phosphorus application to the rate and amount that a plant needs to grow. There's a lot of what's called legacy phosphorus built up in the soils across Michigan, and in particular in western Lake Erie Basin, and moving forward with limiting phosphorus application to only what the plant needs will really help in trying to cut back on some of that legacy phosphorus problem. Michigan is also the only state in the entire country that does not
sounds like we may have lost Charlotte. So what she was going to say is that the state of Michigan is the only state in the country that doesn't currently have a statewide uniform septic code and requires septic inspection requirements. And so that's something that I know the Michigan League of Conservation Voters is prioritizing as something that they want the state legislature to address. And then finally, the need exists for additional funding for water quality monitoring in the state of Michigan. The current source of funding for water quality monitoring is a state bond that's scheduled to expire very soon. And currently, there's no plan to substitute that funding. And so the state of Michigan needs to take a hard look at what they're going to do to make sure that water quality monitoring continues for Lake Erie and around the state, and that it's actually improved to fill some of the gaps that exist in water quality monitoring in Michigan. So Michigan needs to make some important policy changes to protect Michiganders and one of our most precious natural resources, water. And with that, hopefully Charlotte will be able to rejoin us for question and answers. But at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Tony to talk about what's going on in Ontario.
Thanks, Molly. Just checking to make sure that you can hear me.
We can hear you fine.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so as you can see on the slide in front of you, the top line view here of the situation in Ontario as it relates to the status of runoff reduction policies. So we've kind of got a smattering of incomplete and some non-existent situations as it relates to our policy framework for reducing nutrient pollution to Western Lake Erie in Ontario. I just want to kind of remind folks that every year, thousands and thousands of people flock to the shores, the north shore of Lake Erie in Ontario for a whole range of really important activities that are critical to the local economy, whether they're heading down to Point Pelee or Long Point Pelee for the monarch migration, which is we're in the midst of right now, or the spring and fall bird migrations at Long Point and Point Pelee. And also, for those that don't know, every Friday the 13th, one of the largest gatherings of motorcycle enthusiasts in North America, for sure, I think, occurs on every Friday the 13th, including the one that occurs in about 3 days, I believe, in Port Dover, so more up into the central and eastern part of the lake. But the point being that all of this is really vitally important to the population, to the local economy, out in that part of the province of Ontario. So protecting and restoring the health of Lake Erie is really about protecting those important economic activities, recreational activities, not to mention the wildlife and drinking water quality for many of the communities along the shoreline. So in terms of how a few of the policy priorities shake out for Ontario, we have seen a very solid draft, I would say, domestic action plan from our, well, we have a domestic action plan developed by the province of Ontario and the government of Canada together. And the process through which that's been developed has been very robust. A lot of engagement. Great to see the two levels of government collaborating. But when you look at that plan, you recognize that there are a lot of gaps, and there's things like a lack of timelines and clear responsibilities. And most importantly, I think, with all of these action plans that are being developed, but speaking to ours in particular, is how do the various elements of the plan fit together to put us on that pathway to a 40% nutrient reduction, to hitting that target over the next, out to 2025. Because we know that this is not, there's no silver bullet solution, and that's kind of what we're trying to get at with this report, is that it's a comprehensive policy package that is needed in each of the jurisdictions, really, to effectively address the problem and to keep Lake Erie healthy over the long term. So just a few highlights from Ontario that I'll touch on, and happy to speak to others in the Q&A. But spreading of manure and fertilizer on frozen and saturated ground. You'll see in the assessment that it is ranked as incomplete, and that's because while we do have regulations under Ontario's Nutrient Management Act that prohibit the spreading of manure in winter months, there are gaps, including the fact that the prohibition does not apply to spreading on saturated ground. So it does apply on frozen ground, but not to saturated ground. Enforcement is also a significant issue as it relates to this. We rely significantly, if not almost exclusively, on complaints by the public into regulatory agencies as the primary enforcement mechanism. There's some good news in here, though. The draft action plan, as I mentioned, being developed right now by Canada and Ontario, clearly recognize there are gaps, and Ontario is committed to considering further restrictions on the application of nutrients during the non-growing season. So a gap that we hope, is in the process of being filled. Second one, and this, others have spoken to the need for comprehensive nutrient management plans or comprehensive plans to reduce nutrient runoff. Here again, we have a status of incomplete for Ontario. And again, under the Nutrient Management Act, there is a framework that requires plans or strategies to be developed for managing nutrients, but only for livestock operations, and only for livestock operations that are above a certain size. Maybe more concerning is that field cropping operations are completely exempt from the regulations, from the framework. And this is particularly concerning for Lake Erie because most of the agricultural land in the watershed is used to produce field crops, corn, soy, wheat. And just to be clear, these field crop operations are exempt even if they are using manure to fertilize. That's an important and significant gap in the nutrient management planning framework in Ontario. Here again, enforcement of these plans is certainly not as comprehensive as it needs to be. In fact, a study by the Ontario Auditor General found that in 2013, only 3% of the farms known to have to adhere to the Nutrient Management Act regulations for proper storage and application of manure were inspected. So only 3% inspected. There's been some action taken on that front, which is great news. In 2015, 2016, the government brought into force a risk-based approach to inspections. But in terms of how that's translated to action, still only about 18% of the high-risk farms are being inspected. So significant kind of gaps in both in what the coverage is as it relates to the development of comprehensive nutrient management plans, but also in their implementation and enforcement. And finally, I'll just reflect a little bit on the on water quality monitoring. Like the other jurisdictions, there are gaps in the system, such as limited event sampling to capture and understand the impacts of those big, intense rainfall or snowmelt events that we know are a major contributor to the problem. Those responsible for the various agencies responsible for monitoring water quality in Ontario are certainly aware of these challenges and looking at ways to address them. Groups like the conservation authorities in Ontario, which are watershed-based, are certainly aware of this and thinking through how to better capture the impacts of these important events. As much as 90% of the total phosphorus load to a river can be delivered during those storms, especially during spring or on-off period when soils are saturated with typically bare of vegetation. So again, just reinforcing that, what we need to get to as we further develop and improve monitoring frameworks in Ontario is certainly more investment and more widespread monitoring, but also that money gets spent strategically to really catch and understand better those events that are really driving the algal blooms, and the ones that we need to focus on as we start to measure the impact of the actions that will be taken to make progress towards the 40% reduction target. So that's a quick look through Ontario. I'm just going to round out this part of the conversation here with maybe the key takeaways from the report as a whole. So as we've indicated, when you look at the regional level across the 3 jurisdictions we've focused on here, the kind of top line view is that progress to date has been pretty lackluster. We found the progress to be mixed, so it's kind of different in each jurisdiction, but importantly, none of the jurisdictions has in place the kind of comprehensive policy regime that will be needed ultimately to address the challenges facing Lake Erie, to get to that 40% reduction target and to get to and to sustain a situation where we have a healthy lake. So immediate and sustained action is needed, right? We need to get moving. These action plans that are being developed are vitally important for the long term. There are a whole suite of things that we've outlined in this report that can be moved on even before those plans are finalized. So we need to be driving action at the policy level so that we're having the impacts on the ground that are needed to manage the phosphorus reaching the lake. And then the one important point to raise with everyone is that, at the front end I described this report as a baseline assessment. So it's comparative in the sense that we look across the 3 jurisdictions, but it's baseline in the sense that this is our first kick at the can. This is our first comprehensive look like this. I'm happy to say it's not going to be our last. We do intend to revisit this assessment on a regular basis, and we want to do that to make sure that using a consistent framework that we are able to report back to the public on a regular basis to tell the story of if and how these policies are being implemented and scaled up as needed, because that's really what it's going to take to bring us to a healthy Lake Erie over the long term. So I'll just round out by saying on the slide in front of you, you can see the URL that you can visit, and at that URL you'll find the full report, an executive summary report, and fact sheets pulled from the report for each of the jurisdictions, for Ontario, Ohio, and Michigan. And I think I'm turning it back over to Molly to round things out.
Yeah, so thanks to you guys on the phone, today we were able to deliver 13,855 petitions to Ohio, Michigan, and Ontario, calling on the governors and premier to do more to rescue Lake Erie. Next week, the governors and premier are meeting in Detroit. So now is your chance to tell them that they must do more to protect Lake Erie and the people who depend on it for their drinking water and livelihoods. They owe the public a report on progress and an outline of specific next steps that they plan to take to clean up Lake Erie. And we're going to be there, so we'll circle back with you to tell you what we learned. You can call the governor's offices in Ohio and Michigan and the premier's office in Ontario, and we've made this easy for you. You can do this by going to greatlakes.org/takeaction. It's the first action in our Action Center, and I hope you'll join us in calling on the governors of Ohio and Michigan and the Premier of Ontario and asking them to do more for Lake Erie.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you to all of our presenters. We are able to take questions now. I see we already have a number in the queue, so we'll get started right away. If you do have questions, you can use the chat or question function, which is in the GoToWebinar menu bar that you should have on your screen, as illustrated here. Before we get started on questions, I just want to double check and make sure that we have Charlotte back on the line. Charlotte, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Sorry about that, guys.
Okay. No, that's all right. Glad you can be here. Okay, so we're going to try and get to as many of these questions as possible. And maybe I'll start off with Molly for a big picture question. We have a question asking, do any entity or entities control or govern the Great Lakes sort of as a whole? including Lake Erie? So we've talked a lot about the individual jurisdictions. Is there any one entity that can sort of tackle this problem by itself?
Unfortunately, the answer is no. So the Clean Water Act provides some protections on the U.S. side, and also I think the Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act in Ontario and in Canada provide some protections. But really, it's up to the jurisdictions, each of them individually, working with the federal governments of Ontario, of Canada and the United States to solve this problem. So there isn't one simple answer or one jurisdiction. It's going to take all three working with their respective federal governments to address the problems in Lake Erie.
Thanks, Molly.
Yeah, it's Tony. Tony, if I can just elaborate a little bit on that. Not only is there not one entity, as this report demonstrates, there's a suite of policies that, at least in Canada, are under the purview of a bunch of different ministries at different levels. So some may be federal, under Environment Climate Change Canada, for example. The bulk of the things that need to happen fall under provincial jurisdiction, but maybe under the Agricultural Ministry, Environment Ministry, Natural Resources when you talk about wetlands. So that's why these plans are vitally important, because that's to be the mechanism that draws these things together. The important thing is that it draws them together on the ground, not just on paper.
Thanks, Tony. The next question is, I think might be for Charlotte or Christy. This is a question from TJ Pinataro, who I know is with the Buffalo News. And he asks, what role do you think the federal standards for ethanol in gasoline plays in the need for increased cropland, fertilizer, and thereby agricultural runoff into Lake Erie? Haven't the harmful algal bloom problems been exacerbated since many of these federal policies and the ramp up in corn started in the early 2000s? Maybe Christy or Charlotte, I'll start with you if you have any thoughts on that question.
Hey, yeah, this is Charlotte. I think it's a great question. We definitely think that the ethanol mandate has exacerbated the issue in Lake Erie and in many other places across the U.S. I think given sort of high incentive to grow corn that the ethanol mandate delivers, we've definitely seen a huge level of conversion of crop fields over to natural areas over to corn production, and a lot of that some of that can be tied back into the ethanol mandate. And I think there's some evidence out there that had we not had the ethanol mandate, or had we had it at a lower level, perhaps some of this would have been mitigated. That being said, it's not a one-to-one. I don't think that if you get rid of the ethanol mandate, you 100% solve the problem. But I do think that there is some force there on the U.S. side that's leading to the conversion of natural areas into corn production, which then requires a lot of phosphorus and a lot of nitrogen to produce in a way that many other sorts of crops don't.
Thanks, Charlotte, for that, for a great answer. Thank you. We have a number of questions here that I'll condense, asking about Indiana. As many of the participants clearly know, Indiana, part of the watershed that flows into Western Lake Erie is in the state of Indiana. And so people are asking, what is Indiana doing to address this issue, and why they were not included in the report. Molly, do you want to start with that question?
The short answer is that Indiana's not doing much to address the problem. So you guys are absolutely right that Indiana is a contributor to pollution in the Western Lake Erie Basin. However, they don't actually have any shoreline along Lake Erie. And so it's been easy for Indiana to duck responsibility in terms of doing its fair share to address and solve harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie. We didn't include Indiana in this report because Indiana actually did not join the commitment that Ohio, Michigan, and Ontario made to reduce phosphorus flowing into Western Lake Erie by 40% by 2025. We did put pressure on Indiana to do that. We think Indiana absolutely needs to be part of the solution and that Indiana should join the commitment. At this point, they haven't, and we hope to look at Indiana and its contribution and policies in the future.
Thanks, Molly. Christy, I think I'm going to toss this next question to you. We have a couple questions about cover crops, and so I'll condense them and say the question seems to be, what sorts of cover crops are you hoping will be part of any future plans? Could you talk a little bit more about cover crops and what that would mean?
Well, I think first I should say Ohio has a Clean Lake initiative where they provide funding for farmers to implement cover crops, as well as I know there's federal programs. But we really, the Ohio Environmental Council does not believe that we should dictate what best management practices should be utilized. And I think that would go back to cover crops as well, right? It's really what we believe needs to happen is that the farmers are working with the professionals, such as the Natural Resource Conservation Service out of the USDA or the Soil and Water Conservation Districts, to really determine what kind of best management practices are needed on each of the farm fields. Because what we have found is that through NRCS, they're saying that in Ohio, in the western basin of Lake Erie, that about 95% of farmers are using best management practices. But we're no longer talking about those small mom and pop farms that we think of fondly from like the Laura Ingle days or Little House on the Prairie. These farms are really, really big. And so maybe having one best management practice on a farm field, that's great, but you need a lot more. We need a ton more. So cover crops have been shown to really help reduce the amount of phosphorus flowing into Lake Erie. There are a number of different cover crops that people use. I would say that the farmer needs to work with the certified professional to determine, put that plan together and have that certified professional say, here's the cover crop that you should be using based on your fields, and make sure that it actually does occur.
Thanks, Christy. I have a question about fertilizer and manure application on frozen ground. I'm not sure if this would be best for Charlotte or Christy, so I'll send this over to you. The question is, how implementable is a ban on fertilizer or manure application on frozen ground? Can it be enforced, and will the landowner argue that he or she didn't know the ground was frozen?
Well, this is Christy. I think, how enforceable is something like that, I think is, first, we need to get something in place, right? We know that spreading on frozen or snow-covered ground, saturated soils, if it's going to rain or snow, is not appropriate practice, and you'll hear farmers say that as well. We are a complaint-driven, and Tony said this, Ohio also is a complaint-driven state, and that is a problem. And so we really need to close that door on kind of that big gaping hole and require enforcement. And so have Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Soil and Water Conservation Districts to do some random audits. We'll also still need to rely on that complaint-based system, but the problem is there's not enough resources as well. So, for instance, I was driving up from Columbus, Ohio to Toledo, noticed there was some manure on the road right next to a waterway, and I contacted the Ohio EPA. Didn't get out there for quite a while, and it's because, well, there are probably many reasons, but one of them is that there's not enough people on the ground to be able to do the enforcement that's really needed or to do follow-up. So it's going to need both, and that is, random audits and inspections on a regular basis, inspections, but also we'll still need to rely on that complaint-driven based system.
This is Charlotte. I completely agree 100% with what Christy said. I think enforcement is key, and just getting the ball moving in terms of a ban is key. I would also say that I think by and large there's a lot of understanding within, I can't speak for every farmer in Michigan, but I think there's wide understanding that, applying really fertilizer, commercial fertilizer to frozen ground is not a good soil management practice, and it's wasting money. In fact, this stuff is not seeping into the soil, and so it doesn't really add in terms of soil health. The real issue is that we've got just an overwhelming amount of manure, and a lot of that is from these concentrated animal feeding operations. A cow produces an unimaginable amount of manure, and there's not a lot of places, there's not a lot to do with it, right? And so in Michigan, the concentrated animal feeding operation permit requires 6 months of storage, but sometimes you get into a bind and things happen, and so application in the winter has become kind of a last resort in terms of just getting rid of manure. It's not about sort of health of the plant or health of the crop or the soil. And I think if we kind of look at it in that sense, then looking to both banning the practice, but also finding ways, finding better means to manage that manure for farmers, I think would really help in terms of the actual implementation of this and it being a successful policy.
Thanks so much, Christy and Charlotte, for that great answer. I'm going to toss this next one. I guess I'll start with Molly and Tony. The question is, what can Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump do to assist in the remediation of this situation?
Yeah, so this is Molly, and one thing that President Trump could do is throw his support behind the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. In his FY 2018 budget, President Trump zeroed out the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and that funding provides critical support to Great Lakes states for efforts to get more voluntary practices on farmland that can reduce runoff into Western Lake Erie and into all of the Great Lakes. And so in his FY 2019 budget, which will be coming out next year, we'd really like to see President Trump put his support behind the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Tony, I'll turn it over to you for Prime Minister Trudeau.
Sure, and of course our situation is a little bit different in that how the power is distributed is different. So it's really the whole governing party, right, led by Prime Minister Trudeau in this case. A couple of key things. First of all, to kind of follow on what Molly was just talking about, the noise and the very important backlash around the zeroing out of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative raised some questions in Canada around what our investments look like, and kind of gets back to something I was saying earlier, that these efforts are distributed really across different levels of government in Canada, what needs to be done and what is being done across the Great Lakes and in Lake Erie, and different agencies or ministries within levels of government. But one of the things that our federal government certainly can, and I believe should be doing, is looking to the GLRI to consider a similar type initiative, a coordinated initiative and sustainably year-over-year funded initiative to focus on the sustainability of the region and restoration of the Great Lakes. Beyond that, there's a couple of other key elements that I think are very important. I think continuing to have our government send the message that the Great Lakes are an important binational resource. And when I say government, I mean Ontario and Quebec and the federal government, and letting U.S. decision makers know that we're here alongside to make sure that we protect and restore this hugely important freshwater ecosystem. And then at a more specific level, I think we're just in the process. I think it may be finalized and being close to starting down to implementation is a new agricultural policy framework in Ontario. In Canada, and that's an important mechanism through which funding will flow to support things like best management practices. So that's something else that can be done, and that rolls out through joint implementation with the provinces. So those are just a few of the things that I think our federal government can be doing to address this issue.
Hey, Jennifer, if I may, this is Christy. I want to build off of what Molly was saying on the U.S. side a little bit. And the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is so important, so I want to underscore that as well. But there are a number of other funding programs that will make or break Lake Erie, I believe, and some of them are like the Conservation Technical Assistance Grants out of the USDA. That funding goes to those professionals, like the Natural Resource Conservation Service professionals that are out in the communities and the counties. So in Ohio, we have 88 counties. We have 72 offices. And I think less than half of them are filled right now. And so there is a critical need for these professionals to be on the ground, to be able to work with farmers to develop these plans and to put into place plans for good soil health and good water quality. Also, I know that NRCS uses those funds to pay for folks like the Soil and Water Conservation District professionals. There's the Sea Grant funding that was on the chopping block as well under NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. And in Ohio Sea Grant was one of the first on the scenes taking monitoring samples out in Lake Erie and working with the water utility to really understand what's going on. And they continue to do open lake water quality monitoring. There's other programs like the USDA Regional Conservation Partnership Program, where Ohio got $13 million, partnered up with Michigan and Indiana at the tune of, I think it was $17 million total, but $13 million to work with farmers. Actually, it might have been billion, sorry. To work with farmers to put on these conservation practices, to put conservation practices on their farm fields. So when we're looking at the federal budget, there's a lot of programs that were slashed under President Trump's proposed budget, and really hoping that our congressional members are paying attention, and I know that they are, and being the reasonable voice here, and recognizing that we can't raid one funding program to fill another, because there's a lot of programs out there that are really important to be able to handle this problem in Lake Erie.
Thanks, Christy. We're coming up on the top of the hour, and so we're going to ask one last question. I know there are a whole number of questions we didn't get to, but hopefully people will be able to download and read the full report and ask questions offline. Molly, I'm going to send this last question to you, which is asking about what voters can do to help, and I would broaden that to, what can the average person out there do to help on this issue?
Yeah, so one thing everybody can do right now is to call your governors and premiers, so in Ohio, Michigan, and Ontario, and ask them at their leadership summit next week in Detroit to provide a public accounting of progress toward the 40% commitment that they made 2 years ago. Another thing, anybody near the Western Lake Erie Basin, if you use Western Lake Erie, is, as a voter, if you're out there and there is a big harmful algal bloom, take pictures of it. Share that with the media. Share that with your decision makers. Share that with your friends and family. I feel like getting that information and having people exposed to those real stories about how your life is impacted by harmful algal blooms in Western Lake Erie or wherever you live is a critical part of motivating people to solve this problem. And so, there is a role that everyone can play in making sure that this is an issue at the top of the agenda for decision makers across the region. And as a sort of final comment, all of the states and the province have taken some steps to address this issue. So, I just want to be clear that we're not saying that the states and province haven't done anything. They certainly have. They've done different levels of things, whether it's agriculture, urban pollution, or monitoring and reporting, but they all need to do more. And so this is a really serious issue. It demands a serious response. And while everyone has a role to play in solving the problem, we really do need leadership from the jurisdictions, and we really do need them to step up and take urgent action to address this urgent problem.
Thank you, Molly. And I'll make one last pitch for calling your governor or the premier. If you visit greatlakes.org/takeaction, the very top action alert has talking points for you, and it also has a phone number that will connect you directly with the governors of Ohio or Michigan. And we also have contact information for Premier Wynne of Ontario on that page as well. So thank you all so much for participating today, and have a great afternoon.